Part 1. When Europe started to die. What if death moved faster than the news? What if an entire continent slowly realized that no one was safe? In the 14th century, Europe faced one of the most terrifying disasters in human history. Not a war, not a fire, not an invasion, a plague, a sickness so deadly that it made cities silent, villages empty, and families disappear overnight. This was the Black Death. And when it came, it did not just kill people. It changed the world forever. At first, nobody understood what was happening. People became sick without warning. A person could feel normal in the morning and be dying by night. It started with fever, then weakness, then pain, and then came the most terrifying sign of all. Strange swollen lumps under the arms, near the neck, or in the groin. Dark, painful, growing fast. These were the buboes, and for many people, they meant death was already near. Some victims coughed blood. Some could barely breathe. Some became confused, weak, and unable to stand, and the fear spread almost as fast as the disease itself. Because this was not one sick person. It was many, then dozens, then hundreds, then entire streets. In some places, church bells rang again and again. In others, they stopped because there were too many dead and not enough people left to bury them. But the most terrifying part, no one knew why it was happening. There were no modern doctors, no microscopes, no antibiotics, no understanding of bacteria, only fear, rumors, prayer, and panic. Some believed it was punishment from God. Others thought the air itself had become poisoned. Some blamed the stars. Some blamed strangers. And when people are terrified, they do not always look for truth. They look for someone to blame. The Black Death did not arrive with a warning. It arrived like a shadow, quiet at first, then impossible to ignore. Merchants carried goods from faraway lands. Ships crossed the seas. Trade routes connected cities. And hidden among the cargo, death was traveling too. It moved from place to place unseen. No army marched behind it. No king announced it. But once it entered a city, life could collapse in days. Markets became empty. Doors stayed shut. Neighbors stopped visiting. Parents feared their own children. Friends avoided each other. And every cough, every fever, every knock at the door felt like a message from death itself. The Black Death was not just a disease. It was terror made invisible. And Europe was about to learn how fast a civilization can break when fear enters every home. Part 2. How Death Entered Every City. Imagine seeing a ship arrive at port and not knowing it carried death. That is how the Black Death spread, not with warning, not with drums, not with armies, but with trade. In the 1300s, Europe was more connected than many people realize. Merchants traveled long distances, ships moved between ports, caravans crossed dangerous roads, goods flowed from Asia to the Middle East, and from there into Europe. Silk, spices, grain, cloth, wood, metal, and hidden among these valuable things, something far more deadly. The plague moved silently. Most historians believe it was caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, but people at the time did not know that. They could not see the real enemy. The disease often traveled with rats, and on those rats, tiny fleas carried the infection. When the rats died, the fleas looked for a new body. Sometimes that body was human. That is when the nightmare truly began. A ship could arrive looking normal. The sails were up. The cargo was ready. The crew looked tired, maybe sick, but not always obviously dying from a distance. Then the ship docked. Goods were unloaded. Workers touched crates. Merchants spoke to sailors. Rats slipped into the streets. And suddenly, the city had already been infected. No one knew it yet, but death had entered through the harbor. One of the most famous stories comes from Messina, in Sicily, in 1347. Ships arrived from the east, and many of the sailors were already sick or dead. Some accounts say the people were horrified by what they saw. The ships looked less like trade vessels and more like floating graves. But by the time people understood the danger, it was already too late. The plague did not stay in one place. It moved fast. From port cities to market towns to villages to great capitals. From Italy to France. From Spain to England. From the Holy Roman Empire to Eastern Europe. Road by road. Ship by ship. Town by town. It was as if the map of Europe was being touched by a dark hand, and every place it touched began to change. People started to notice patterns. A city heard that another city was dying. Then traders arrived anyway. Then a few people became sick. Then many. Then panic. Sometimes people tried to close gates. Sometimes ships were turned away. Sometimes travelers were feared. But medieval Europe had no real way to stop something like this. The world was connected enough for the plague to spread, but not advanced enough to understand it. That made the Black Death even more terrifying, because it did not feel random anymore. It felt unstoppable. It was moving with human life itself, with business, with travel, with everyday survival. The same roads that brought wealth now brought death, and the same ships that connected the world became carriers of horror. By the time Europe realized what was happening, the plague was no longer arriving. It was already everywhere. And in the next chapter, the real nightmare begins. Because once the Black Death entered a city, people did not just get sick, they started to abandon each other. Part 3. When people began to fear each other. What happens to a society when even love becomes dangerous? That was the true horror of the Black Death. It did not only kill bodies, it destroyed trust. At first, people still tried to care for the sick. Mothers stayed with children, wives stayed with husbands, friends visited neighbors, priests came to pray, doctors came to help. But then they started to notice something terrifying. The people who stayed close often got sick too, and then they died. Slowly, a terrible lesson spread across Europe. To touch the sick could mean joining them. And once people understood that, something inside society began to break. Families started to pull away. Neighbors shut their doors. Friends stopped coming. Some people were left alone in their beds, too weak to stand, too thirsty to move, too frightened to understand why no one returned. This is one of the darkest truths of the Black Death. In many places, people did not die surrounded by loved ones. They died abandoned, not always because others were cruel, but because they were terrified. And fear can make ordinary people do unthinkable things. Some parents fled from sick children. Some children ran from sick parents. Some husbands left wives. Some wives left husbands. Even servants refused to stay. Even doctors often died trying to help. And priests, the very people many turned to for comfort, were not safe either. They entered homes to pray over the dying, They listened to confessions. They stood beside the sick, and many of them caught the plague too. That made the fear even worse, because if holy men were dying, then who was protected? Who was safe? The answer, it seemed, was no one. Soon, daily life began to collapse. Shops closed, markets emptied, work stopped, fields were left untouched, animals wandered. Food became harder to find. The normal rhythm of life disappeared, and in its place came silence, a strange, heavy silence. The kind that tells you something is deeply wrong. In some towns, there were so many bodies that people could not keep up. Graves were no longer enough. Mass burials began. Bodies were carried in carts, sometimes several at once, sometimes many. Some were buried quickly, without ceremony, without names, without final words, without the dignity people once believed every soul deserved. Imagine that, a world where death becomes so common that even mourning becomes impossible. There was no time, no strength, no room. And maybe that was the deepest wound of all. Not only that people died, but that they died in a world too overwhelmed to grieve them properly. The Black Death turned human closeness into a threat. A hug became danger. A kiss became risk. A hand on someone's shoulder could feel like a death sentence. And when a society begins to fear touch itself, it changes forever. The plague was no longer just spreading through cities. It was spreading through the human heart. And in the next chapter, fear becomes even darker. Because when people could not explain the plague, they began looking for someone to blame. Part 4. When fear turned into blame. When people cannot understand a disaster, they often stop asking what caused it and start asking who. That is exactly what happened during the Black Death. The plague was invisible. People did not know about bacteria. They did not understand infection. They did not know about fleas or rats or how disease truly spread. All they knew was this: people were dying, fast, everywhere. And when fear becomes too large to carry, many people look for someone to blame. At first, people searched for explanations in religion. Some believed the plague was punishment from God, a punishment for greed, for sin, for pride, for the moral failures of society. And in a deeply religious world, that idea spread quickly. People prayed, they fasted, they confessed, they begged for mercy. Some joined public acts of suffering. One of the most extreme examples was the Flagellants. These were groups of people who traveled from town to town, whipping themselves in public. They believed pain and punishment might convince God to stop the plague. Crowds gathered to watch. Some were inspired, some were frightened. Some joined them. It was a desperate act from desperate people. But prayer and suffering did not stop the disease. And when that failed, fear turned outward. Rumors began to spread. Whispers, accusations, stories with no proof, but enormous power. In some places, people claimed that outsiders had poisoned wells, that strangers were spreading sickness on purpose, that certain communities were secretly responsible, and these lies became deadly. Jewish communities in particular were falsely accused in many parts of Europe. They were blamed for poisoning water sources or causing the plague through dark conspiracies. There was no truth in these accusations, but truth becomes fragile when panic takes control. And the result was horrifying: violence, persecution, expulsions, mass killings. Entire communities suffered not because this caused the plague, but because frightened people needed an enemy they could see. This is one of the darkest lessons of the Black Death. The disease killed with infection, but fear killed with hatred. And sometimes the second wound lasted even longer than the first. Because once a society accepts a lie during a crisis, that lie can spread as fast as any plague. Not everyone believed these accusations. Some leaders tried to protect the innocent. Some cities resisted the madness. Some people understood that panic was making everything worse, but many did not. And in the chaos of mass death, reason became weaker. Emotion became stronger. Suspicion replaced compassion. And the world became even more dangerous. The Black Death was no longer just a medical disaster. It had become a moral disaster too. A test of what people would do when fear entered every street, every church, every home. And too often, they failed that test. Because when people feel powerless, they may choose cruelty simply to feel control again. And in the next chapter, the plague reaches its full power, not just as a sickness, but as a force that begins to break the entire structure of Europe itself. Part 5. When Europe began to collapse. What happens when death does not stop at people, but starts destroying the system itself? That is what the Black Death did to Europe. At first it looked like a medical disaster, then a social disaster. But soon, it became something even bigger. The plague was no longer only killing the sick, it was breaking the structure of daily life. Too many workers were gone. Too many farmers were dead. Too many craftsmen had disappeared. Too many families had been erased. And when enough people vanish, a civilization begins to shake. Fields were left empty. Crops were not harvested. Food became harder to grow. In some places, animals wandered without care. Tools sat unused. Homes stood silent. The people who had once kept life moving were gone. This created a new kind of fear. Even survivors were not safe, because if the farmers died, who would grow the food? If the miller died, who would grind the grain? If the blacksmith died, who would repair the tools? If the priest died, who would bury the dead? The Black Death did not only take lives, it removed the people who made society function. And that changed everything. In many towns, labor became rare. Suddenly, workers were more valuable. Survivors could demand higher wages. Servants could leave old masters. Peasants could ask for more. Landowners and nobles did not like this. For centuries, Europe had been built on strict social order. Power at the top, obedience below. But now that order was cracking, because death had changed the numbers. There were fewer workers, and that meant the people who remained had more power than before. This shocked the old system. Some rulers tried to stop wages from rising. Some passed laws to force workers to accept old pay. Some tried to hold the social order in place as if nothing had changed. But history had already moved, and it was moving through loss. Even the church was shaken. People had prayed for protection. Many had trusted priests and religious leaders, but churches were overwhelmed. Priests died too. Monasteries suffered. And many people began to ask painful questions. If so many innocent people were dying, where was God? For some, faith became stronger. For others, it became more complicated. The plague did not destroy religion, but it did damage certainty. And once certainty is broken, the world feels different. The Black Death left Europe wounded in body and unstable in spirit. This was no longer just a season of sickness. It was the beginning of transformation. The old world was still standing, but its foundations had cracked. And in the final chapter, we will see the strange and powerful truth. The Black Death was one of the worst disasters in history, but it also changed Europe forever. Part 6. The Plague That Changed the World. How can something so terrible change history forever? That is the strange truth of the Black Death. It was one of the deadliest disasters humanity has ever seen. And yet, out of all that suffering, the world that came after was not the same. The plague killed millions. Historians still debate the exact number, but there is no doubt about the scale. Entire towns were emptied. Families vanished. Communities collapsed. In some regions, so many people died that the land itself seemed abandoned. For years, Europe lived with the memory of that horror. And memories like that do not disappear quickly. They reshape people. They reshape nations. They reshape the future. After the Black Death, workers mattered more. Labor was harder to replace. That gave surviving peasants and laborers more bargaining power than before. In many places, the old feudal system weakened. The rigid structure that had controlled so much of medieval life began to loosen. Not everywhere, not instantly, but the change had begun. Wages rose in some areas. Social mobility slowly increased. The balance between rich and poor shifted. And once a system begins to crack, new possibilities enter the world. The Black Death also changed how people thought. It forced Europe to confront something brutal. Life was fragile. Order was fragile. Even the strongest institutions could fail. That realization stayed in the culture, in religion, in art, in politics, in the way people understood death itself. Paintings became darker. Stories became more haunted. People looked at life with new urgency. Because after a plague like that, the illusion of safety is gone. And maybe that is why the Black Death still fascinates us today. Not only because so many died, but because the plague revealed something universal. Civilization can look strong until something invisible enters it. A sickness, a fear, a breakdown of trust. And suddenly the things people assume will always be there, food, work, safety, order, begin to disappear. That is why the Black Death is more than medieval history. It is a warning, a mirror, a lesson about fear, a lesson about survival, and a lesson about what happens when a society is forced to rebuild itself from grief. The plague brought death on a scale few could imagine. But it also changed Europe in ways that lasted for centuries. That is why the Black Death was not only the end of millions of lives. It was also the end of an old world and the beginning of another. If you enjoyed this story, keep watching more powerful history videos here on Spin a Yarn English. And if you want to improve your English through real stories, subscribe and keep learning with us.
Thanks! Please subscribe and like. Spin a new yarn with us every week.